Tonight we kick off the whole weekend. We start with what we are considered among the greatest legacies of Charles Goodman, his built communities. We're honored to have Mary Means here tonight, a visionary and a leader in the world of community planning, to help us begin this journey. We also have a panel of experts who will share, experts in your communities, who will share history, information, anecdotes, maybe we'll get some gossip, I don't know, about living in Goodman homes in Goodman neighborhoods. So it'll be a nice opportunity to find the reality. Before that, and I'll call you up in just a minute, Bill Fogarty will welcome you on behalf of the Unitarian Universalist Church of Arlington. He's an active church member, longtime active church member here, and they're informal or formal church historian, I'm not sure which. He also is a real estate lawyer, so if you need any advice, you can talk to him later. He will introduce you also to this magnificent structure. They're setting the stage really for what we hope will be a weekend-long exploration of Charles Goodman, ranging from theory to practice, from architectural vision to the practicalities of living with architectural vision. And a lot of us know how that works. I'd like to thank the many people who worked many hours to bring this event together, and of course our generous sponsors. Our co-chairs, Maurice Patel and Frederica Ahrens, who made me promise I wouldn't do this, but I want to acknowledge them. And then also the program chairs, who have done a fabulous job of pulling this program together. So Elisabeth Lardner on the page here, a well-known landscape architect, and someone who's well-known in her field. She'll be moderating tonight. And then Mimi Sadler, who is not here tonight, she's picking up one of the speakers, who will be the MC tomorrow. So enjoy the weekend. Keep your program close. Get your ticket back in tomorrow. And take this opportunity to carry forward Goodman's vision of creating community through architecture. One reminder, you can record your CEUs at the registration desk, or there's also a QR code there, I believe, where you can do it online. So without further ado, Bill.
Well, good evening, everyone, and let me begin with the basics to let you know. Welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Church of Arlington. Back in 1964, when this sanctuary was open, so to speak, it was the Unitarian Church of Arlington. We added the Universalist. Now, bathrooms are, when you leave the sanctuary, you turn to your right down the hall, or you can go back to the left to the James Reed Center. There are some bathrooms down the hall there. But I would like to, I think the unofficial historian, I was cleaning up the archives. I found so much in it. In fact, I found some old site plans from 1960 of this building, and I put them on easels back there. You can take a look at it. So I just want to orient yourself a bit here. In 1948, the church was founded. In the parking lot, they built a brick building for the hall. It was the 1950s, baby boomers, and they put a big addition for our Sunday school next to it. That was option one. Option two. Option three was to then build a sanctuary on the far end of the school, also in brick with a nice steeple. And I found those plans. But then Charles Goodman came along, and folks from the church worked with him, and they ended up having what's a very difficult capital campaign, but this beautiful sanctuary was built and opened in 1964. And again, it was just the sanctuary here in 1964. And this has changed a bit. In 1994, the Kearns architect did a great job of putting us under one roof. So back where there's a fellowship hall and there's classrooms downstairs, it was called Under One Roof. The Kearns group, I think, did a great job with it. Some of the back panels of the church have been placed in the stairwell. If you look at the stairwell when you leave, you'll see some of those panels are there. And those who may be like architects, there's a sketch of the golden mean, the golden ratio in one of the panels on the floor as you leave. So Under One Roof came in 1994, then in 2012 we had a capital campaign, and we built the addition there with the center and activity room downstairs. And that time, we did change the sanctuary a little bit. We updated the chancel, and up here we added these panels here, which any change is always controversial, but especially in the video age, this was added. The candles were behind me, now the candles have been put on the side. But basically, we're here in this beautiful space, and people always say, especially when they come for a service and you can see the trees. And I will say, when the church was built in 1964, this was all trees here, and they called it the tent under the trees. And it's been a great space for us to live in and to be a community. So that's my quick history lesson. Thank you for coming. This is so wonderful to have you here and enjoy the program. Thank you.
Good evening. It's a delight to welcome you all here. For the few of you who don't know me, I'm Elisabeth Lardner and worked hard with Mimi Sadler to put this program together on behalf of the Friends of Hollin Hills. And I just want to say tonight, it's my pleasure to welcome and introduce you to Mary Means. As Barbara mentioned, Mary's a visionary, a leader in the world of community planning, and well known as, we call her the mother of Main Street at the National Trust for Historic Preservation. Mary's work has been recognized with 5 national awards from the American Planning Association and the National Trust. More importantly for us tonight is Mary's keen understanding of how community forms. When we first came up with the idea to recognize Hollin Hills' 75th anniversary by celebrating Hollin Hills in conjunction with other Charles Goodman communities, my first coffee date was with Mary. She's been a mentor to me, a colleague, and to whom I still owe graduate school tuition for teaching me how to better engage communities. And of course, Mary, who's bright, thoughtful, and superb at connecting the dots, said, we should bookend the event you're talking about, Elisabeth, with a neighborhood conversation and neighborhood tours. Here we are this evening, thanks to Mary, gathered together to hear Mary's thoughts on how our Goodman neighborhoods shape community, and to hear from neighborhood representatives on why they chose to live in a Goodman. We owe Mary a thank you for instigating this evening's event and Sunday's tours. Mary has written on how Goodman's plan for Hammond would, however informal it may appear, intentionally is shaped to form strong community bonds. Following Mary's presentation, we'll have a panel discussion between panel members and invite you to ask questions. And the handout that you got is because we're in this lovely space that speaks of Charles Goodman. Those of you who live in a Goodman house know there are no walls. There's a lot of light, and at night there's a lot of ambient light. So instead of a slideshow, we've made a handout. That's the slideshow, and Mary will speak to the handout. Panel discussion will speak about their experiences, and then we invite you to ask questions. In addition to Mary, we have Allison Heck. And Allison has lived in Hollin Hills for 8 years with her husband and 2 daughters. She's a descendant of the original Hollin Hillers. She almost has a picture of her grandfather on a tractor creating the trail in Paul Spring Park. And as the past park chair, that's a really cool concept to me. She was drawn to the neighborhood after hearing and visiting the neighborhood where her mother grew up between the 1950s and 70s. Allison is also a trained urban planner and recently retired from her position on the Alexandria Commission of the Arts after 9 years, helping to develop and implement its public art program. We also are joined tonight by Brad Kemp, who's been a resident of Highland Hills for over 10 years and president of the Highland Hills Neighborhood Association for the last 2 years. Those of you who don't leave the DC metro area, this is the field trip for you to go to Chesterfield County, south of Richmond, and visit Highland Hills. He's owned restaurants in the Richmond area and is doing what little he can to help his wife turn as much of the land around their house as possible into vegetable and fruit gardens. So go visit Brad, knock on the door, and assess his progress. Michael Pass is a resident of Hickory Cluster at Lake Ann in Reston since 2007, and he studied architecture at UCLA. And Michael is hosting a tour of Hickory Cluster, which I urge you all to attend. It's an amazing complex of buildings just off of Lake Ann in Reston. Michael describes himself as a childless Maine coon cat guy with a passion for scuba diving, swimming, and cycling. And then Michael says he never really bought into Charles Jenks' postmodernism depth of modern architecture, crude Ico myth. So we should be in for a pretty robust and wonderful and stimulating conversation this evening. But first, please welcome Mary Means.
Charles Goodman's Unitarian Church here. I was a member here for many years when I lived in Alexandria, and I can tell you that I had never been in Unity Temple until about 5 years ago, before its restoration. And when I walked into Frank Lloyd Wright's Unity Temple, I suddenly saw the roots of the building here, with the clerestory windows and the squareness of it. That was the first, it's considered the first modern church that kind of didn't look like, here's the steeple and all that. And this one is a really well-executed homage in many ways to that. Other people here, some of whom I've met this evening, have a much deeper knowledge of Charles Goodman, and they're going to follow me this evening and certainly tomorrow. But I wanted to speak about living in a remarkable Goodman neighborhood. Be sure you've got the handout. Elisabeth explained about the slide situation here. You don't need to follow along. I'm just going to make some references in here, and you can see some illustrations there, and you guys can put the thoughts together. Let me give you a little bit of background. Growing up in Atlanta, my father was a classical architect. He believed the last good design had happened about 1850. I'm not kidding. He really was immersed in classical, like 18th century architecture. So I went away. Naturally, I became a historic preservation planner and all that. And I was utterly thrilled at age 27 when the National Trust for Historic Preservation hired me. So I called him in my excitement. Dad, they want me to open a Midwest regional office to help make preservation happen in 10 states, Dad. Isn't it great? Silence. But sweetie, there's nothing worth saving out there. I'm writing a memoir, and you just heard the title of the memoir. Okay. But I knew he was wrong, and I set out to prove it subconsciously. One lasting result is the network of Main Street communities across the country that use the preservation-based revitalization strategies that a team of us developed in the Midwest in the 1970s. Virginia is a Main Street town, a Main Street state, as are 43 others. There are about 2,000 designated Main Street communities with active downtown programs across the country. It was supposed to last 3 years. Subconsciously, my work has always kind of grown or been influenced by the writings of Jane Jacobs and William Holly White, whose 1970 observational studies of how people use public spaces really transformed urban design, and it really changed how I experience place, including my Goodman neighborhood. So with that as a preface for it, I've lived in the metropolitan DC area since 1980. The first 30 years here in Old Town, walking daily from my house to the office my firm shared with Elisabeth, Lardner, and Jim Klein. Through them, I learned a lot about Hollin Hills and Charles Goodman. I fell in love with the vibe of it. The presence of nature, the abundant light that bathes houses like theirs. I loved Old Town Alexandria. My father would have too. But in 2010, when my new partner, now my wife, and I decided to buy, she asked me what I'd most like. I took her to Hollin Hills. She liked it too. Yet, as a biracial lesbian couple, we were reluctant to live in Virginia. A few days later, she came into me with a listing. Isn't this what you're talking about? It's in Maryland. So we've lived in a Goodman neighborhood in Wheaton, Silver Spring ever since. We walked in, saw the house, and said, this is it. This is exactly us, and we've loved it ever since. Our small house, it's less than 2,000 square feet, is one of 55 in the Hammond Wood Historic District, designed by Goodman in 1949-1951. It's listed on the National Register of Historic Places. We're a district. I never thought I'd ever live in a historic district that is younger than me. My father would be absolutely horrified. And I didn't do it to do that. Actually, I think he might have changed a bit. No, he wouldn't have. Well, in the 1950s, subdivisions and suburban houses were the epitome of undesirable in his mind. And in the 1950s, they were spreading very widely. Remember Little Boxes, the song? I think most of us in here are old enough to remember that. Scraped land. They would then take all the trees down with their whirling, rows of near identical houses marching down curvilinear streets or stubbed cul-de-sacs. That's what suburbia was. Hammond Wood was different. It is different. Goodman is really best known for his architecture, but his attention to site planning was equally brilliant. Unusual among his peers, Goodman partnered with builders out of his passion for making good design accessible to working people. His respect for nature led him to envision siting houses with topography, avoiding mature trees. Imagine Silver Spring, Wheaton area in 1951, as developers rapidly turned farm fields into housing, Cape Cod's ranchers, all marching down new streets, leading off Connecticut Avenue and Fierce Mill Road. Both of those were still unpaved at the time. But as you turned onto Pendleton Drive, it was different. The street structure of the heavily wooded 15-acre site had already been planned when Paul Hammond and Paul Burnham bought it and brought in Charles Goodman, the designer. Goodman rejected the plan, which required extensive clearing of the site. Instead, he let topography and the site's mature trees guide his hand. Hammond Wood is obviously different from the streets of the small Cape Cods that surround it. Our little neighborhood is like here, and everything around it is small Cape Cod housing. Here, Goodman brought his pioneering natural land planning, his use of exposed structural framing, glass window walls, and creative interior floor plans. As a result, Hammond Wood was featured in the May 1962 issue of Progressive Architecture. Hammond Wood houses are not identical, but related. It's like they're from the same family. There are 5 house types, largely rearrangements of building blocks that take cues from topography. Each is sited on its lot to take advantage of the sun. One of the brochures, there's a picture of it, I think, in the handout, advertises "Live in a Solar Neighborhood." That's the one across the road from us in Hammond Hill. That was a brochure, and that was how they were pitching Hammond Wood. And though the lots are small, they're only about a quarter acre, something like that. Therefore, near the house next door, you were going to be very near your neighbor. Goodman was careful in placing the houses not in the marching setback, the same setback for all of them, but individually sited to catch the sun and afford privacy. He just shifted them to several degrees off of parallel. None of our houses are on that are lined up the way any houses around us are. Pendleton Drive is the spine. College View crosses it, and Highview forms the western edge. It's small. There have been a few alterations to the houses, and where they've been more seriously changed, the work was done by architects descended from Goodman's office. Other speakers are going to reflect, I'm sure, on Goodman's architecture. I want to focus on Goodman's site plan. I tell people, we knew we got a great house, but we had no idea it came with a great neighborhood. New urbanists would tell you that none of this should work. The key to having a lot of neighborhood cohesion is having front porches and sidewalks. It's essential for community. Hammond Wood has neither of those. We don't have front porches and we don't have sidewalks. Yet as neighbors, all of us know one another. I've never lived in any place in Chicago or around here where it's the case. We know each other, we help one another, we celebrate milestones, we help dig each other's cars out when it snows. We even treat renters the same as owners. How's that for a sense of real community? Where else does that ever happen? I believe the bones for all of this are in Goodman's site plan. In many subtle ways, the plan enables community. It enables a remarkable level of community. So what's the magic? It starts with the absence of driveways and garages. We all park on the street. The streets are narrow. There are no sidewalks, just rolling curbs. Is that safe? Working with Jim Klein, the other half of Lardner Klein, on scenic byway planning, I learned a lot about the psychology of speed. To navigate our narrow streets and parked cars, drivers naturally slow down. Lots in Hammond Wood's sloping terrain generally vary in size from about a sixth to a quarter of an acre. They're small enough that most of us take care of our own lawns and gardens. And as we go about the daily living, as we all do, we bump into each other as we garden, or we bring in groceries, or we wash cars, or we're walking dogs. Nearly everybody in our neighborhood has a dog. In the course of these daily activities, we have brief, and sometimes not so brief, conversations. Sometimes a couple more people come out, and a little cluster conversation begins to happen. Friendships grow. We also share our contact information on the Hammond Wood listserv. Need a chainsaw? Got one, I'll bring it over and help you. It's Friday, the grill's fired up, and we have hot dogs and chips. Bring your burgers and beers. 10 people show up and the party's on. This happens quite regularly. In Hammond Wood, there are 3 courts, or cul-de-sacs. At least once a year, the residents of one of them turn it into the court party. I don't know how many years we've been doing it now. There was an interruption for COVID, but we're back to it. It's a potluck picnic. And it has festive sparkle lights, because it goes on until midnight, a fire circle, and s'mores. Kids, dogs, elders, alumni who've lived in Hammond Wood or grown up there, which Mark McAnuff did. And my wife's famous jerk chicken just is over. You gotta get there really early to get that. Our neighborhood is multi-generational and multiracial, and Hammond Wood is a great place to grow old. We are multi-generational. I'll come back to my last sentence. As a widow, Selma, who was one of the last original Hammond Wood settlers, lived alone. During the pandemic shutdown, she turned 100. Word went around, and a party took shape on her lawn. Balloons, frilly tablecloth, 100 tiny cupcakes, and a score of us masked and singing happy birthday as she walked out to join us. With pandemic isolation, we really missed these gatherings. And now we miss Selma, who died last winter at 103. Then there's the margarita wagon. You've probably seen the picture in the handout if you look. It's a Hammond Wood spring tradition. Barb, Lloyd, and Gather decorate a wagon with tiki fronds and haul around a vat of the tasty cocktail. Along the route, with ringing a bell, we all wander out with our red cups, and the party just keeps moving along. It happens every year. The realtors don't tell you this, but we think it's a secret selling point to the neighborhood. But all of us experience change in our very historic neighborhoods. So let's talk a little bit about change in historic neighborhoods. We all fear teardowns and McMansions. We all fear poorly designed additions or really sloppy renovations. They can spark sometimes nasty feuds. Imagine there's several of you in here who have experienced that personally. Hammond Wood is not a locally designated district, so we don't have design review. Fortunately, most owners cherish the Goodman look. Many newcomers have deliberately chosen it. They've chosen to be here. I was saying to an architect a little while ago that I don't think there's been a house that's been on the market for more than a week in our neighborhood in the time we've lived there. Most of the renovations have been sensitive. For example, before my next door neighbors, Dobie and Revita, bought their house, an earlier owner had covered up most of the facade's window walls, hiding a distinguishing feature of Hammond Wood houses. Recently, Dobie and Revita restored the window walls. Check out the before and after picture in the handout. It's made a remarkable difference. Not long ago, a new owner, about to replace her windows, changed her mind when a neighbor told her by doing so she could reduce the value of her house by $100,000 or more. So far so good, peer pressure has worked. Nothing, however, can prevent a teardown. Except these days, as Michael Shapiro, the realtor, can confirm, Goodman houses demand a stiff premium, which along with our small lots, keeps McMansions at bay. Caring for these houses in the spirit of Goodman takes a lot of effort. Our listserv maintains a contact file of expert contractors who can replicate our huge window panels, deal with our Goodman leak. I guess you probably have one too. These houses are brick and cedar. What I mean by that is they're brick and cedar siding, and Goodman's affinity for reclaimed brick was great, ahead of his time. My father did that too, by the way. The brick came from demolished mills and warehouses, probably in Baltimore. There's only one problem. The salvage yards kind of mixed together the brick that was fired for exterior use with the brick that was fired for interior. And after 7 decades, most of our chimneys have serious masonry fails that cause recurring leaks where ceilings meet the chimney. Chimney companies bring stock one-size-fit-all solutions for this problem. Demolish the chimney down to the roof line. Rebuild it with brick that will look nearly like these. We envy Hollin Hills for having Bob Fina, an amazing contractor skilled at repairing Goodman chimneys. But alas, Mr. Fina doesn't work in Maryland. It's taken us months to track down his counterpart. David Gibney is a renowned expert on restoring brick and masonry, does a lot of work for the National Park Service, and he takes a surgical approach. He's doing the work for my neighbor Pat Price and me in about 2 weeks, at about 20% of what the chimney guys wanted. A strong component of community is respect for difference. When Goodman and his builders were creating Hammond wood, the use of restrictive covenants in deeds was commonplace all over the country. Some dealt with alterations, but many, many more prevented the sale to Negroes and Jews. In 1950, Steve and Gladys Kraft were new parents, outgrowing their apartment in Shirlington, here in Northern Virginia. Looking for a house, they soon learned most subdivisions were off limits to them due to restrictions preventing sale to Negroes and Jews. In Maryland, as well as in Virginia. Hammond wood did not. The Crafts bought their house while it was still under construction. Gladys lived in it until she died in 2022. She was loved by all, truly Hammond wood royalty. She recalled that many of her early neighbors started out as a hotbed of democratic politics. Now, most of the neighbors at the time were Jewish and quite politically active. It remains that way today. Have you noticed that we fans of mid-century modern tend to be liberals politically, or in our outlook we're progressive? We don't go for colonial houses. Sorry, Dad, I had to reference that. Next year is Hammond Wood's 75th anniversary. We're not likely to mount an ambitious celebration, maybe a more elaborate margarita wagon parade. So it's a pleasure to really take part in yours, and I want to congratulate all of you who have worked so hard for a year, 2 years now, to make this event possible. So that's enough for me. I want to hear what my fellow panelists have to say and get into some conversation with you. And by the way, just because we're in a church doesn't mean that the front row is off limits. If you in the back would like to come up and have a better conversation when we get started, you would be welcome to join the first couple of rows up here. There's plenty of seating. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Mary. We're going to move through and let people on the panel also speak to why they moved to a Goodman community. We may start with Allison. What brought you to a Goodman neighborhood? You returned? You knew of it when you were little?
Yes, so as was mentioned in the intro, my grandmother and grandfather were original owners on Bedford Lane in Hollin Hills, which is one of the first areas that was built up. So they purchased, I think in the early 50s, because that photo of my grandfather plowing is from 52. And unfortunately, my grandmother passed away when my mom was and my grandfather died early, so I have all these oral traditions, right? So in a way, I'm gonna say in a very positive way, the term I'm gonna use, I was groomed to like a certain type of architecture and idealize a certain type of neighborhood. And so every time that my parents would come and visit my dad's mom, who lived, as my mother would say, on the wrong side of Route 1, from Hollin Hills, we would drive through and check on her house, make sure it was up to par. I grew up with that instilled in my head, and my dad always said he longed to be a Hollin Hills kid. So it was really not just the architecture and that these houses look completely different from where I grew up, because I grew up in a very rural area across from a wheat field and next to a cow field, so not a lot of architecture to take in where I grew up. Really felt the pull to come back to what my roots were when I decided to live in DC. And of course, it's not easy to get in a Goodman home, as Mary mentioned. And I was lucky enough in 2016 to see a house come on the market in November. Not a normal time for a house to come, and I saw the price drop, and I saw it drop again. And I thought we might be able to do this, because we were looking all around the area, and we were able to, with the help of Jody, who was in the back, put in a good offer and really realized the dream I had of having my children have the childhood my mom had, and that was really what drew me to it, just the sense of inside, outside, and the community stories which I'll scatter throughout our conversation.
Thank you. Brad, you're in a neighborhood outside of Richmond. How did you end up in that Goodman neighborhood? Did you even know it was a Goodman neighborhood?
I had no idea it was a good neighborhood. I think this was back in 2014. We were house hunting, and I think most people, I never heard of the neighborhood at all, and I was only found it with help of my dad, who owned a house that I briefly grew up in, about a mile away. And I think just actually today, talking to people, I think it was a little bit of maybe wish fulfillment for him, because he had driven by these houses a lot in the 70s and 80s, and I think kind of has always wanted more modern architecture, but never really had an opportunity to live in anything like that himself. And so he pointed us out another house in the neighborhood, and then we saw the house that we eventually bought, but had no idea of the architectural history or even the age of the houses. We just knew when we looked online and did a tour that it was unlike anything else in Richmond, and it was almost kind of shocking, because we've been looking at houses all around town, and with the huge windows, the low slope roofs, the large overhangs, it was just very different than what we were used to seeing, and pretty much instantly we knew we wanted to live there. Have just ever since then kind of mostly been really good experience, seeing the seasons change and seeing the landscape change, and kind of having a new experience of living in a house that I didn't really have growing up, and neither did my wife. So sort of an accident, but a happy accident. And then what's really interesting to see as time has gone on in the last 10 years, a lot of the more recent homeowners have, I think, been much more aware of the history and of seeking out houses like this.
Thanks, great. Michael, how did you end up in Hickory Cluster?
Well, it's a long story.
Short.
All right, the abbreviated version is, my mother is of German heritage. She insisted that our family live in a modern house. We did in central Illinois, and I was talking with Brad about how it looked very much like a national home. It had the top large panel, smaller lower panel, multiple units in the front. Even in Arizona, we lived in an adobe brick modern house. Fast forward about 30 years, when I married my then wife, her parents lived, I believe, in an Eichler house in California, in Rancho Palos Verdes. So we were both modernists. We moved out here. I was recruited by a management consulting firm. packed up her daughter and I and our cats. We ended up buying a deck house in Great Falls. She insisted on living in Great Falls. So from there, we ended up coming over to dinner and visiting Reston a bit, just across Route 7. Years later, I even brought my mother to dinner at the former Jasmine Cafe at Lake Ann, a wonderful place, unfortunately no longer there. We walked around, a friend and I walked around, and even through Hickory Cluster. And I remember looking in one home at the end of Maple Ridge Road and saying, boy, I'd really like to see the inside of that house. The owner of that house is now my fiance. So I had a neighbor in Great Falls after Janet had moved back to California, who lived in a kind of a Frank Lloyd Wright-ish brick and wood home in Great Falls in Springview Court, I think. And she said, I know a house that you're going to like. And so she introduced me to a Goodman house on Maple Ridge Road, right next to my fiance's home. And I bought it within a week. It was a 3-story Model A home, very similar to one of the houses on the tour that we'll be giving on Sunday. It had been modified to build out one of the top decks, so instead of side-by-side decks, it was just one. And they look, to be honest with you, they look kind of clunky on the outside. Very external structural system, post and beam, but the space inside is wonderful. And I encourage you to come on the tour if you haven't already. And by the way, I've posted the tour guide with floor plans and photographs of the homes. If you go to hickoryclusterAssociation.blogspot.com, the top post is about the symposium. It's the former official website, not the current official website, but it's got a lot more stuff.
Thank you. You don't even have to find a fiance. You can just go on the tour. Thank you. House care and joys and headaches of owning a Goodman. I'm going to have some conversation up here, and then we'll open it up for people if they have questions in a bit. I'm going to go back to Brad because one of the coolest things he mentioned, and he had it on the table, the plaque that with 500 words or less you could maintain your house. If you called National Homes, the hotline.
Yeah, it's, I guess, I know it's in our home. The plaque I have at our table is from a neighbor's home. And it is literally, I think it's meant more as directive to the homeowner and perhaps contractors that they use of, I guess, things to be aware of working on the house that they might not normally need to be aware of working on other houses of the time period because of unique construction methods and stuff like that. But the idea of, but it also starts with the idea of having, when we buy a car, we have a manual for the car or a TV or computer or anything like that. But the idea that you have sort of a care manual for a house is like very, I think, industrial driven, which may have also kind of driven it. Now, it's very inadequate towards actually maintaining the houses, obviously. There are a lot of issues. The only thing we've done in our house is we've done painting, a new painting and a roof. And the painting we ran into the siding is, I think, masonite siding, which is not only a material that no one makes or uses anymore, but the width of it is a non-standard width. So at one point we're looking at having to replace some of the siding, and then you can't get siding that's the same size, so we're restyling the entire house to make it look the same. Unfortunately, we were able to preserve the original siding and save that hurdle. And then the other issue we've had with roofing is because of all these low slope roofing, ventilation through the attics. They have small kind of crawl space attics is like very poor or can be very poor, and so we have to do additional ventilation to kind of help prevent rotting, because we essentially had plywood in the roof that was like spongy and getting about to collapse because it had just gotten so moist and retained that moisture over time. So those are two particular headaches that I've encountered.
Mary mentioned having a listserv, or maybe you mentioned, is that another way of forging community in houses that are hard to take care of?
Yes, I think it is. It's useful for just a list of the vendors, the various services that have worked in the houses. I am not aware of how much work has been done that actually required something as sophisticated as understanding how to point these bricks. I mean, there are a number of houses in our neighborhood that the chimney people have done. I don't think there are any where they've actually taken it down to the roof. I wanted to mention that I don't know if Virginia has this, but Maryland has there are historic tax credits for folks who are in National Register districts, but usually you can't use them if it's a house and you live in the house. Maryland allows homeowners to do a 20% state income tax credit. And my neighbor Pat and I have just gone through the process of applying for this. They require you to photograph every room in the entire house, all the closets, everything, all the exterior from different angles, blah, 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 blah. You submit what you're going to be doing, all of that. And you can get up to 20% of the cost of the renovation. Pat's had the experience recently of she's going to be doing some power washing and painting, and the state has asked what is the material that they're going to be using in the solution for the power washing because of the substrate of a historic building. And both of us are going, these houses were built in the 50s. This is not one of the Tidewater plantations. But it's been a headache, but a number of our neighbors have been able to replace furnaces and things like that with it. My neighbor Gladys, who lived across the street, diagonally across the street from me, she and her husband twice replaced the gravel roof. Our houses all were made with tar and gravel roofs. She was really upset and put off replacing the last of them. I mean, she'd been there since 1950. And she really wanted to continue that. Steve and she were dedicated to it. There isn't a roofing company around that will do it. If they do that kind of roofing, they want to do a big warehouse somewhere where it's easy to drive up to and they can do it in a day. So she had to settle for the same color, but in a regular asphalt shingle roof.
Maintenance, ideas, nightmares, good things, how to make friends, fixing your plumbing.
I can double down on the heating and air conditioning. So I think when we purchased our home, it was purchased from a second owner, but who had been there very early on for a long time. And I had 2 young children, and our air conditioning never worked. Our central air never worked. And then Friends of the Hollin Hills put on a set of series about, I think, energy saving. It was very full, that lecture, so I think it's a common issue. And we asked, basically, we had FINA come and said, do everything that you said in your lecture. And so he did everything, and then I didn't have to use the auxiliary AC I bought in the summer for my children in the back of our house, in the only centrally aired part of our house. So, but what we found was a lot of craziness in our venting and structural, and then we had to lower one of the main pipes, and then he also did do my chimney, so I did get him to do my chimney. So a lot of our early days in our house were spent on things you couldn't see to help the house function and kind of get back in functioning order. And then I'll speak to my renovation specifically about the radiant floor heat, because I had original radiant floor piping throughout my concrete slab, and I was extending my kitchen to basically double it. And our architect was very concerned about disrupting those pipes. And I remember talking about it a lot because we were putting in footers, and just really concerned about if we break one of those pipes, the whole system's gone. And so when my builder started to take it away, those are some serious pipes. They're very thick and they did just fine. We were very lucky, but it was a big concern thinking about a renovation where you're extending your foundation, and we were actually able to extend our radiant floor, so our whole kitchen still has it, but that was another fun, I wouldn't call it maintenance issue, but something you also have to think of, because sometimes they leak, and our neighbors did leak, and they had to redo their entire bathroom, so you have to watch it.
So at cocktail parties in these neighborhoods, people talk about plumbing. People talk about orange brook pipe. People talk about all sorts of things. In Hickory clusters, you're talking about your very amazing, very innovative, now very aged geothermal air conditioning system.
That and a few other things. When I think about this issue, I think of two data points. One is sports car owners are usually happiest with their vehicles, but they are maintenance intensive. And the other is a story about Frank Lloyd Wright, who's one wealthy owner, called Mr. Wright up and said, Frank, I'm sitting eating dinner and the roof is leaking on my head. And Wright's response was, well, move your chair. We have our share of issues. These houses are not for the faint of heart. They're labor intensive, maintenance intensive. You've got concrete, which by current standards is not as good as it could be. We had $1 million garage replacement in one of our blocks, block 3. There was a plaza and a garage space under it. It had to be torn down because the concrete was literally dissolving. We just recently, in fact, end of June, beginning of July, those of us whose owners at the time did not pay up front, we had 30 years of $40 or $80 a month on our monthly assessments to pay off that loan. So that's done. We've replaced plaza concrete because it was falling apart, and we've got concrete beams that are very maintenance intensive. So we have to have specialists work on those things. We've got flat roofs, so unless you get a commercial roofer who really knows what he's doing, there could be problems there. But it's architecture. It's not a Camry. It's an Audi or a Beamer. People are there and they don't necessarily leave because of the maintenance. They leave for other reasons. But they do buy the houses because they are Goodmans, and they like a lot about them, and they still like it when they've lived there for years. The houses rarely are on the market for more than a week, sometimes not on the market at all because they sell ahead of time. So there's something there, despite the labor and maintenance intensity, that people love.
Thank you. We're going to switch a bit. Living in neighborhoods, Mary alluded to Hammond not having the design controls. Hollin had them in their covenant and now has a zoning overlay district. That might be interesting to touch on because that's also a very important cocktail conversation about how did you make it through the DRC? How did you get through the ARB? How do you keep your neighbors from doing an addition that blocks your view out your bedroom windows?
I think the margarita wagon is a much better solution for conversations. We ought to be hearing from them a little bit. Questions from them. It's striking that if anyone out there was thinking that they'd come to this to learn about the joy of owning a Goodman, they've left by now.
Let's talk just a bit about the zoning process, and then we've got time we can open it up for questions. So, did you peer pressure? Do you want to speak to your experience? Well, we don't really want to be totally depressive.
No, I'll speak
Positive
to,
side.
I'll bookend the Hollin Hills additions. So I'll talk about my grandfather's additions and then mine and how they've changed. So my grandfather did 4 additions to his home on Bedford Lane, and then I think there was a 5th addition after he sold it. And I'll leave a little story in here that's fun. So a lot of folks on Bedford were just out of their army service or with military service and looking for jobs, and Davenport, as the builder, recognized talent. So he hired Rick Bricklemare to sell. He hired my grandfather to do stuff on the weekend, and then actually had him for a year out on his farm in the middle of Virginia. And my grandparents rented out their house. But what that did is it created this pioneer spirit of the early adopters of the neighborhood, and they all did additions roughly around the same time, but they knew the project manager, Matt McCauley, and he did most of their additions. So while we do, if you look on the DRC and Hollin Hills, we had design guidelines. This is me waxing a little assumption here. I'm pretty sure Matt just said, this is fine, and went and built it, because they were still building the rest of the neighborhood. When I did my addition in 2022, we had just, it was right on the cusp of when we were adopted into the local zoning requirements. And so I was the first house to go through the ARB approval. Lucky me. And it was luckily our final design. So we had gone through 2 rounds of the DRC, we had talked to our neighbors, and then we were the first house that came to the ARB, and I think they were not yet accustomed to the Hollin Hills. It was a very different type of architecture that they weren't always reviewing. They were used to reviewing older things. It went pretty well, actually, almost smoother than the DRC, I think, because we were the first one. We had a very modest addition that we were doing, and we had a well-known architect who had worked on a lot of Goodman homes. But I will say that, it's budgeting into your architectural to have someone who knows how to get through those meetings, and then the time. So it did bless up our budget a little bit, and I think it was an extra hoop to go through, but I do think it is helpful for us to have, as a student of historic preservation, it's helpful to have that local ordinance for that extra structure, but it does add costs to the residents that they need to think about when they want to do something to their home.
Any other comments, or how about folks in the audience, questions for Elisabeth?
I just wanted to mention that in Reston, we have 2 homeowners associations. We have Reston Association, which is the overall community, and then we have individual neighborhoods that are known as clusters. So we have cluster associations as well. Now, when somebody buys a home there, they basically agree to the covenants and restrictions. They also agree to cluster standards and design guidelines as a part of their purchase of a property there. So they should know what they should or should not do. The board of directors of the neighborhood, the cluster, should be monitoring what's going on and enforcing compliance. Enforcement is specifically a part of their charter. And then Reston Association should be enforcing design guidelines as well that are a little broader and focused more on maintenance as opposed to design. Cluster standards are more design elements. Unfortunately, depending on the folks that are involved in these organizations, the system can fail at every level. So it's absolutely critical that the covenants be strong, that the standards be strong, and that you have people that are focused on preservation as opposed to giving way to the 2 strong forces that are at work here. One is entropy, things fall apart, energy seeks its lowest level, and anarchy, which is where people want to just do what they want to do with their houses that they bought, despite the historic significance of them and the actual market value of them, because they are special. Depending on the folks that are on the boards, that can be, you can get preservation orientation or not.
Thank you. Okay, now, do folks in the audience have questions for these? I have more questions. I can keep
Can I ask a member of the audience a question?
Yeah, you can ask.
Mark, you grew up in Hammond Wood, and you are a superb contemporary architect. And you and I had a conversation about the tragedy of Goodman. And I wondered if we could get you to say a few words about why we don't have houses like this and neighborhoods like this all over the place. You might introduce yourself, because I didn't.
I'm Mark McIntyre, I'm an architect. I grew up in Hammond Woods between 1949 and 1955, 70 years ago. I was going to talk about this tomorrow, and I'll talk about other stuff too. There's an undercurrent to me of tragedy in all of this, which is that nothing like this, and I'm very aware of what's happening around the country at all times, going back 60 years. Nothing like this has happened since. And particularly if you look at the land use side of it, and again, I'll talk about this tomorrow. Contemporary architects are not hired to make communities, and And when they're hired to make communities, if they are, they're not hired to do the site plans. If you take those things away, there's nothing left. So essentially the development community, which is the commissioning people to do these things, has been going backwards essentially since the mid-50s. And they're now back in the 30s. And I don't know how to deal with that. I don't know what to do about that. But that is the undercurrent of tragedy that I see here.
Thank you. Anybody want to add to this or bring up another subject? We've got these folks from different neighborhoods. It's a chance to sort of compare and contrast or live vicariously in another community. As I was teasing Mark, did he need a passport to come across the river? People going up and down 95? Or you're all satiated? Yes.
This is really following up on what Mary has said. I'm sorry. Julia Heine. I'll be part of the same panel Mark is on tomorrow where we're talking about living in Goodman's, among other things. I'm one of Mary's neighbors in Hammond Wood. And I just wanted to make two comments. One that had to do with planning. Probably 20 years ago, AIA Boston's magazine had an article about mid-century modern planned communities and how they were designed to be communities and to be neighborhoods. And when I read it before I moved to Hammond Wood, but it did make a big impression on me, and I can see a lot of the principles, some of which you mentioned, but one of the ones that struck me was, they said the distance from front door to front door is very small. And when I went to Hollin Hills for the Hollin Hills house tour, your lots are quite a bit bigger. In Hammond Woods, our lots are small, and with all the cul-de-sacs, because it's based on cul-de-sacs, with wedge-shaped plots that shoot out from the cul-de-sacs, there are numerous houses where from front door to front door, it may not be 20 feet. And I do think that's been a big contributor to, as you say, with no sidewalks, no driveways, no garages, in and out is a big way that you meet your neighbors. And another comment, which is really just an example, a good friend of mine, Janet Bloomberg, whose house is the Hammond Wood house that will be on the tour on Sunday. I was somewhat instrumental in getting her to move to Hammond Wood, and after she moved here, she said, you know, when I would talk to you about it before I moved, you always talked like you knew all your neighbors. And we do. We know every person in every house. We know who belongs to every house. And she said, I thought, maybe she knows them. Maybe she knows a lot of the neighbors, but she doesn't know them all, and I'm never gonna know them all. And she said, after she lived in the neighborhood for 3 months, she told her 4-year-old son, if you have a problem, you can go to any house. And I think that is amazing, absolutely amazing. And I think that says everything about the community that we have. And I'm thrilled with it.
I would say if any of you are saying it's too far to go up to Silver Spring on the tour tomorrow, don't miss Janet's house. I think she did an addition, and she did it so brilliantly. I never would have thought of it, and Mark might have, but I never would have thought of doing it the way she did, with a connection between the two, the old and the new. It's an amazing job, and it's very respectful. And I would imagine that if Goodman came back, he'd go, good job, great job.
Thanks, yeah. JG. And it would be useful also if you want to call out your neighborhood, we can have a little.
I'm just going to do that.
Thank you.
I'm J.G. Harrington. I live in Hollin Hills now for almost 32 years. And I was wondering if people could talk about light. Light coming in and also light interiorly. And one of the reasons I ask about that is when we renovated our house in 2007 and 2008, we literally put in almost 100 ceiling lights so that we could have light at night. And I'm curious how people feel about the light in their houses, in their neighborhoods.
When my wife asked, what are you looking for? What is essential to you as we look for a house? My first word was light. I have to have lots of daylight. And these houses do have that, but you're right. After dark, it's a different thing because we've done it with floor lamps and lighting fixtures that are more task level, or at this level we haven't done much. We did one piece of track lighting for the kitchen because the track was already there when we bought the house. But light, to me, I thought you were going to go in the direction of solar, because remember the ad, live in a solar house? We wanted solar panels. So I called up the Maryland, I looked, and Maryland gave this amazing energy conservation grant. It was like really big to do solar panels. So I thought, terrific, we can afford it. And I checked into it, and they were going to, even though it was the Department of Energy, they were going to run it through the Maryland Historic Trust because we were in a National Registry district. So I checked with the Maryland Historic Trust, and everybody here, some of you may know the Secretary of Interior's guidelines for rehabbing a house. It's the test for whether you can get tax credits for it. Maryland said no solar panels that can be seen from the street. We're on a corner. The south-facing facade of our house is where anybody in their right mind would put the solar panels. Well, why don't you try the yard somewhere? No, that's either shaded or it's right there by the street too. So what we did was, my wife will tell you that I came home, they were putting the things on, and I left to run an errand, and I came back, and they had moved them, and I threw a fit and had them redo them and put them where they're lined up with the windows below it. And in my book, if Charles Goodman were alive today, where the hell do you think he put the solar panels? I mean, the guy was crazy about solar. He put them exactly where I put them. And not only that, it's reversible. I'm sure that in a few years, we won't have solar panels, we have something else. But this is reversible. It's on a little frame on top of the roof. So I took your light and kind of beamed it in different directions. Others probably have a light issue too.
You also gave credence to your father by getting them all lined up, so touche.
Yeah, that was the classical architect.
Still a thread there. Other thoughts on light to JG's question? I can give you back on my
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's two sides to this. One is the light, the daylight we get in through our windows is amazing, and one of the principal reasons we bought the house is the main kitchen and sort of dining area has 2 rows of the wall windows, and that's great. I guess it is interesting. Since we never have had to redo our lighting inside, I never really thought too much about how much we have to do at night. What I will kind of say is, and this is, all the sightlines of the houses are directed so that you're not looking into your neighbor's windows, and that's a great thing. But one of the things that also I really think is actually, not to get like voyeuristic about it, but is sort of intimate about the neighborhood as you're walking or driving through the neighborhood at dusk. In people's kitchens usually is where a lot of these window walls are located, is lit up. You kind of get little tableaus of people's kind of lives. Not that you just say stand there and like watch them, but you kind of see what's kind of that people are inside doing cooking, being with their children, are doing things, and it makes it, again, kind of reverses this sort of outside in, brings the inside out, which is kind of, to me, very intimate in a way. So that's been an experience I think.
I would say I definitely have art strategically placed because of that dynamic of a Goodman home. Of when people come up by and they're like, well, they have to have something to look at that's cool, so I'll put my piece that I think is the coolest where they can see it in the evening. I will say in my renovation, I did get a ton of new lights as well, and I've never seen so many light switches in my life. And also, I think that's just, how we've progressed since these houses were built, and we have lighting design, and we've kind of sophisticated some of our planning in that regard. But I will also say about the solar, when I did my kitchen, it's in the back of my house, and I was very specific about wanting to keep my renovation. I talked a lot about public versus private, because we've talked about the siding, and my kitchen was my private space where I'd say, like, I can walk in my bathroom and like I don't, you know, no one sees me and I'm fine and I'm comfortable, because a lot of Goodman homes, your own view, right? And so I wanted a great deal of light so that I could look at my backyard, which is nicely sited on a slope and doesn't look at any of my neighbors who are sited away. But the way we did it with the slope of the roof coming up, we get a lot of solar light. So much so that I had to be very careful about the countertops I chose because of the glare. So I had to get a honed countertop, also because I have a child with light sensitivity. So if it's too bright, she has to be accommodated. So I will say that if you're doing a renovation, you're thinking about the sun coming in, you also have to think about the surfaces you're bringing in, and how that interacts with these solar homes that we do live in.
In Hickory Cluster, Goodman's designs put most of the glass on the rear of the home. So siding is important. I bought my house specifically because it had a near perfect southern exposure. After studying passive solar design, both in engineering and in architecture, I wanted that, and it has worked out very well. In fact, at Shirley's house, she has black tile on her ground floor. She also has electrical floor heating. But the sun coming in just heats up those tiles, and it's the warmest room in the house. At night, the windows, the massive glass can be black holes. I experienced that in Great Falls with a house, the deck house. It was about 30% glass. We have both ceiling lights and our little lights.